well. But back to Omar, he finished by saying, questioning the role of architects. And that's what I wanted to focus today's, and the workshop, if I can call it that anymore. But I wanted to begin with, in terms of an image, I would like to show you I would like to show you a case that was very inspirational for me in San Diego. I showed yesterday a very simple map between San Diego and Tijuana. Remember that I mentioned at the most trafficked border in the world, there is not one single cross-border land use map between San Diego and Tijuana. These two cities do not collaborate at all in the production of systems of representation and so on. And so I've been interested in producing very simple images. Unfortunately, the fields of architecture, in an effort to manage complexity, in an effort to enter into the thickness of the territory, which is composed of many force vectors and so on, we've returned to systems of representation in terms of diagrams and so on, but usually schools of architecture tend to make images that are hugely inaccessible. They are loaded with information that is necessary to really rethink our systems, right? Our projects. But unfortunately, they become way too hermetic. So I'm thinking we're making complexity even more complex. My interest is in more lyrical images, stories, images that can reduce the complexity of certain into more accessible, conceptual tools. It's been important because I work a lot with communities, and this idea of language and images and the power of images. That's the reason the shrinking map for me was like, if I was to show that to my mother, it would like, it's loaded, right? And so, anyway, that sounds silly, but the point is, how can images become tools, political tools? So this is another image. Some of you who were not there yesterday, basically it's an image of showing the large zoning of San Diego, which usually is very exclusionary, huge bedroom communities, small malls and retail places. And so I call it a kind of large chunks of color of the land use of San Diego. And then when you see the border and then you see the high pixelation of alternative, more compacted, three-dimensional uses in Tijuana, it's a huge contrast. Many times I like to draw images of the border without the border, but just a different attitude towards the territory where it demarcates. There is another image that I have of the different green between San Diego and Tijuana. That delineates the border and immediately suggests who has the power to irrigate, or who has ultimately the institutions that are in shape to manage resources, versus the brownish green of Tijuana, which does not, is a more real image of the vernacular landscape, but also shows how deforestation has happened there without any institutions to protect the land and so on. So this is very interesting. Other issues that, because as usual, we just locate ourselves on the line, but not on the attitudes and other conditions. So there are many images. And this one is a very simple one, and probably you all know these devices, but this was a simple image of just erasing the city, erasing all the physical, and just leaving the open spaces, the leftover, the liminal zones. The reason I wanted to recuperate the point that Omar brought up. And I did it with some, to illustrate a case to some students who were working on this. Because as artists, sometimes we go and we focus on the poetics of the physical landscape. Many artists that I work with at the border, we are all enamored with the kind of physicality of the landscape, and usually the project becomes a metaphorical project that interprets that landscape and so on. But very seldom we realize that the archipelago of these sort of chunks was produced by very specific regulation, of course, very specific jurisdictional and regulatory forces that tend to be hugely stupid. I thought somehow, Tijuana, San Diego was the capital of that stupidity, but there is something about, of course, this territory where some of the most, there is no sense in what produces that fragmentation. Anyway, rules of planning In California, of course, setbacks, vacant lots, easements, and so on. The invisibility of these rules is ultimately what produces our archipelago. So I wanted to refocus the attention from the physical to the kind of political, or at least just to confront them as a project in these images. And we focus on two, or primarily one, really strange regulation in San Diego in the planning code. Paper street is embedded in the code. When you do the planning code, there is a definition of what a paper street is. And basically what this is like, the city is made of these regulations. Paper streets are streets, as you can imagine, the city is planned in some desk, not as nice as this one probably, but and with a green marker. That's the reason the walls are called green, maybe, because and then there are the planners doing their grids and so on. When that grid is taken from that table to the territory and dumped, the surveyors came to measure, and some of those streets fell on a topographic condition. I mean, this is obvious. The diplomat's house, that's what I think my intuition tells me, that those houses were designed somewhere else. And that when they were dumped there, the differential between what they designed and the topography necessitated those stupid retaining walls. So here, the street, they never built it, because when the surveyors came, it would be too expensive to build that street. But it is there. What I'm trying to say is that's a paper street. Streets that were never built. So there is an accumulation of paper streets, invisible pieces of public realm, that guess who takes advantage of them? The only people who have the power of the knowledge of this, which are developers. So there is a process in San Diego, California. If a developer comes to a neighborhood and he purchases this parcel, the developer can initiate a process which is called street vacation. These names are really weird. And if no one in the neighborhood reacts or cares, this piece of public infrastructure becomes private, so that the developer can build more, and bigger buildings.
So, sorry,
yes.
I want to make sure that I understand. So these paper streets are the streets that were originally drawn by someone, but then never
built.
So never built?
So they're invisible. Doesn't mean they're only on paper.
They're only on paper.
And what I've been arguing in my the seminars that I teach at the universities, as artists, let's recuperate those invisible pieces to make them into a new kind of system of public space. Call it in the shape of gardens or whatever, but let's recuperate it. It's ours. Right? And so the recognition of the invisibility of jurisdictional conditions, liminal zones, spaces of opportunity that can begin to stitch together a network of a new type of social space in the city. This is a...
So can communities, not developers, who do not own pieces of land around it, claim it as a space of opportunity and things like that?
Exactly.
So it also can be used for the weak.
Exactly. And that's the case that I want to present, because it became a very compelling story. Exactly that. Yes. And please, yes, this is good. Just interrupt me at any time, because yes.
So the city owns it and can sell it to a developer, is this correct?
They don't even sell it. If the developer requests it, if nobody cares, they can give it for free. This is a paper freeway. Never built, and so it created this not only, it's great because it's a canyon, and you see the informal trails of people. Another thing that is interesting is that these empty spaces in the city are surrounded by resources. Other paper streets, dead-end streets, easements that can be wonderful systems of passage. And not only that, which is part of the issue here for me, many elementary schools, community-based NGOs, that's another task. The designer becomes somehow the I call it cultural pimp. I don't know if there is a kind of word here, but a kind of enabler of new relationships across those hidden resources and agencies. Community-based NGOs that can collaborate with the elementary school that is so close but yet distant because they don't recognize each other. A small collective of artists that is photographing the neighborhood, to create an archive of memory. All these activists are ignorant of each other. So everybody's just surviving, right? So how do we enable new collaborations? So for me, that the physical emptiness of this archipelago of voids in the hidden socio-economic infrastructure is the project in this case. Many canyons in San Diego where there are just left as, you know, empty spaces around recycling center, elementary schools, again, all surrounding this. This is another project where, I don't know, many schools in San Diego, many elementary schools are against canyons, and yet the schools are full of asphalt, a chain link fence dividing the school from the canyon. Part of the issue here was, can we let the canyon enter the school, can we make the canyon a pedagogical garden? Can we connect the recycling center to the school? You know, the project is a programmatic, more contingent programmatic project in relating these disparate parts and so on. You've heard of the beautiful project of Alice Waters in the Bay Area where she was the first one to come up with the idea, let's chip away the pavement and produce vegetable gardens. So this is called the edible schoolyard and so on. The rethinking and the retrofitting of these environments. But yes, dead-end streets, informal trails, housing, these are resources. The story I want to share in the context of this, a new role, expanded role of practice, and the relationship of that to these spaces is another one of that archipelago. I don't know if you noticed, but I showed you the drawing of the archipelago fragments of empty spaces, and I'm just focusing on some of those islands. The paper street, the paper freeway, the abandoned canyon, and this one is one that is very paradigmatic in Southern California, is the leftover space between neighborhoods and freeways. And this one is a very particular, very large one. I live nearby, that's the reason I became aware of this project. And again, it's surrounded by interesting resources. Basically, as I was driving from my house to the university every day, I saw that there were this series of kids that were building, and then one day there was a fence around this underpass beneath the freeway, this leftover space. And then I began to interact with them, just asking them, you know, about what they were doing. And for years I've been trying to, I'm constructing a kind of video of this story. I'm interested in stories, by the way, as I showed in the presentation, of retrofit, whether of immigrants that come into Southern California to alter the homogeneity of some of these subdivisions into new, more socio-economic complexities, you know, alternative uses and so on, or teenagers in this case. They, and I had to very lyrically again produce this image, they told me that one day, one night, they gathered in a cafe near this space, and they decided that they were going to go to Home Depot to buy shovels and go under this freeway, which is an amazing space, to just begin digging and constructing their own skateboard park. So that's what they did. They went, they organized themselves, and they came and invaded, you know, this space, which is, in fact, when I went to the municipality to find out jurisdictionally what that leftover space looks like, they gave me this drawing. So this is truly the island. You know, in the archipelago that I showed you, this would be a more accurate chunk of the empty space. They began to dig, and 2 weeks later, the police stopped them, and they barricaded the space, told them to get out. They got really upset. The teenagers said, we're going to fight back. They organized themselves, and at that point, they told me what no student of mine has ever told me, or any colleague. Okay? What was the first task of these teenagers? They were teenagers. The first task was to recognize the jurisdictional power inscribed in that leftover space. Who owns, whose territory is this in the first place? They realized that they had been extremely lucky because they had not dug under Caltrans territory. Caltrans is a state agency in California that governs the freeway, and they're extremely fascist. You know, there is no way. They had begun to dig under Caltrans jurisdiction. There is no way they could have negotiated. They were lucky because the area of the freeway where they began to dig belonged to the local municipality. So there was a space there of negotiation. They were lucky also, they told me, this is the teenagers telling me this story, I'm translating a bit here, that they had begun to dig in what they call a Bermuda Triangle of jurisdiction. Between Port Authority, between Port Authority, Airport Authority, and so on, two city districts, and a review board that runs through this avenue. In other words, these red lines represent, loosely speaking, of course, the jurisdictional fragmentation. And as we know, this fragmentation is what ultimately is the basis of the problem, right? This, not only in terms of policies, but also budgets and so on. Then they decided that as skaters, they would approach the city because the second task that they, after recognizing where they had begun to dig, then now we're going to search for the political actors behind those institutions. So they went to the city to contact city officials, and the case was taken to the city attorney and to the city councils that needed to really take liability for at least who is going to be the city, because there were two city councils. And then they were advised by the city that if they wanted to continue negotiating, they had to become an NGO, okay, because that was the only way of producing some kind of legitimacy as an organization. They didn't even know what an NGO was, but they really had to learn very quickly, and they began to contact other cases in their investigation in Northern California, other skaters who had gone through similar situation. I'm saying this because the exchange of knowledge across activist practices is a huge thing, and the transfers of knowledge. This is what happened in Latin America. It's not like all of a sudden Sergio Fajardo woke up one day with a huge, amazing idea, or Enrique Peñalosa, or, you know, it began in the late 70s in Porto Alegre and trickled into Jamie Lerner, and Jamie Lerner's experience transferred into Antanas Mocus, and this is something that I've been trying to write about, is sort of how this is a transference of practices. So they knew that they had to get a lawyer, construction insurance, budgets, they had to organize themselves further, they had to get familiar with all the different departments that were in charge in the city of that space, from the engineering and traffic department to parks and recreation. They had to open the code and understand the definition of open space, which usually for planners is just an undifferentiated green, only one type of green. And they began to realize what budgets were really being devoted to what the idea of open space is for San Diegans, which is just this big, more like grass, you know, empty spaces and so on. They wanted to expand those categories, they thought. Why can't these underpass be considered part of the infrastructure of public amenities for the city, and why can't we have budgets to do that? So they had to get familiar with all the permits existing in the code, right of entry, encroachment. I mean, I'm saying this because I teach in the School of Art, and I tell my students, you know, the most conceptual material is in the code, you know, in terms of, I mean, imagine encroachment permit, right? And everything is defined. At the end of the day, they created their own bylaws because of the computers. Some of the text is moved. The issue is that they won the case, basically. The city transferred liability from the public, because at the end of the day, that piece of land, this leftover space, is public. So this is a very interesting thing, because from the public it transferred into a semi-private. which was the composition of the NGO, and for 1 cent a year. I'm saying this because the opposite can happen and has happened. You remember Aldo Van Eyck's famous project after the war in Amsterdam of the playgrounds, where the opposite took place. In some of the areas of the properties that were bombed and demolished, while they rebuilt, he proposed why not to build playgrounds, in allowing a kind of transference of liability temporarily. So from the private we can make these parcels public. And that's something that I would like to do also in other areas. But the point is that this became a device for them, and they ended up building their skateboard park under that freeway. And not only that, but they also were able to consolidate budgets. You can imagine the teenagers being a kind of strategist that were really identifying these hidden resources. They were reorganizing the kind of political procedures out of the recognition of jurisdictional power, but also economic one. Because the engineering department, Parks and Recreation department had hidden budgets that were kept separate, and they began to consolidate things. They made a case, and they were able to then produce their own budgets and to make it sustainable. This is a question that I keep asking myself too. How do we produce sustainability for activist practices, which we continue to depend on grants, foundations, and so on, which of course is what we have to do, but how do we make these projects sustainable economically? And this is a very good question. For me, this became a really great example of, in a kind of, as a narrative of how an informal act of transgression can begin to trickle up, introducing a different policy, because now this can be transferred to other underpasses in other neighborhoods, and so on. So I'm interested in that journey. This is what was embedded in the question yesterday too. Sometimes out of our conceptual desire to rethink altogether the composition of institutions, we forget that a modest alteration of something can begin to pave the way for a process that can maybe lead us there. And I'm interested in that sort of small alteration in the kind of reorganizing of the conversation between a small group, like in this case, and some of the political actors. And I think that's the reason I wanted to show you this, because this is part of what I thought would be important in the questions of the practice. Where do you stand in your own practice? This is a question that I wanted to pose. Why are you doing what you're doing? What are the issues that really move you, right? That really interest you? What are the issues that interest you? Where are the sites of intervention or even the investigation? Who are the publics? Who is your audience? Who are the institutions you are negotiating with? Who are the institutions you are unpacking, understanding their mechanisms, their procedures? How do you understand those procedures to be the devices to construct new methodologies? What are the projects or the material practices? What is the medium? I mean, what I'm trying to say is building a kind of, again, once more, a diagram. This is what would be great of this. I call it a practice diagram. What is your position? This was helpful to me at some point, and let me see if I can get this. Here. And this is a very simple, really, because it's part of an animation. It moves and it's more of a dynamic thing. But I began to realize that if there was one topic that I would say is what really motivates me, is the realization that conflict can be an operational tool. The exposure of conflict as a design mechanism. So again, that's the reason all of us are arriving to somehow the same questions with, it implies a retroactive look at what produced the crisis again, primarily at the moment. And I was trying to say, what one of the most intense junctures in history where the crises are accumulating more and more. You know, the crisis across environmental, of course, issues, crisis of public infrastructure, the defunding of public infrastructure, of institutional, socio-economic sustainability. You call it housing affordability, political. There is a crisis across the board. Not only that, a crisis of understanding the mechanisms that enable the kind of way out of the crisis. As I showed the big Homer yesterday, I was saying the problem is not only the way we've been growing, but the problem fundamentally is the way we have been pretending to solve the problem by camouflaging it with temporary solutions. Photovoltaic panels, and, you know, I'm thinking without altering the very politics and economics that have produced this urbanism in steroids, it's very difficult to advance notions of sustainability. And so I was thinking that we keep talking about environmental crisis, for example, only through the vantage point of climate change and so on, which is fundamental. But if we don't see it as an institutional crisis, the crisis of the institutions in rethinking growth. You know, so see those correspondences across many crises. So conflict as an operational tool is one way of thinking. What I thought, this is answering very briefly the question that I was asking you. What is your motivation? What, you know? So I began to see conflict conceptual as a tool. Then I began to also realize that what really motivates my practice is what I would call tactics of translation, praxis. What is his name from the ETH that I was mentioning? Mark Angeli. In some conference he said, we have to, like, the informal, like, no more, something like we need to get rid of the informal, thinking that informal is about just poverty. And I'm thinking that there are so many misunderstandings about what informal means. I wanted to present it as a praxis, as a way, as a kind of methodology, not just a methodology, but it's ways of rethinking the imposition of political systems. And so there is a set of procedures behind informal that I'm interested in translating. So as a set of procedures, yes.
May I ask you about the time span that starts from your diagram until producing alternatives? Because, for example,
yes,
how Kafkaesque are the city structures in the States according to the experiences, which are experiences? Because when I talk about Jerusalem, it's too Kafkaesque. You have a problem in legitimacy, in also re-understanding legitimacy by ourselves, that we recognize the municipality and how much to deal with it or not to deal with it. But I'm really interested in the Kafkaesque process, if there is any, which works against us even in reweaving that possibility of collective, if you want, activism or collective.
The situation is in trying to. That's the reason I was mentioning the issue, the expanded role of practice in this case as a way of serving as an interlocutor. Because it's true that many of those informal, which is true, remain individual, stealth types of actions become in themselves just moments, but how do we produce an economy of aggregation and also of translation so that those, again, I was coming to the end of it, the capturing of the hidden value of those moments with the appropriate political representation, which is a community agencies I work in neighborhoods, can begin a process incrementally through cases, through actual pilot projects that can perform in particular ways, to then begin to expand the categories of land use and zoning. This is what took us, unfortunately, 9 years in this neighborhood in San Francisco. But that's what I'm trying to say. There is a space, you know, of time that is needed in this process of translation and representation to be presented in this case and begin to negotiate an institution in order to, you know, to produce what I would say is an expanded category, simply. I mean, of zoning in this neighborhood, and the idea that the neighborhood can be understood as a site of exception for a moment, of putting a pause in the kind of zoning to enable it as an affordable housing overlay zone and many other things. So this is the reason I'm saying it's very masochistic as a process, but that I feel is what is missing. It's a bit that sort of process by which political representation, informed also by the translation of the meaning of those alterations, can amount to the redefinition of policy. But there needs to be, again, the kind of interlocutor. So this is the issue of mediation, which again, by the way, this is a very simple version, hugely abbreviated, but I began to understand it's very linear. In reality, it's more like this, but that the practice of mediation is what I'm interested in personally. Between, as I was saying, the kind of, if I was to choose a word that is maybe politically incorrect, but it's this cultural thing, okay? I don't know if you know, this is like really awful, but it's sort of this a kind of facilitator. The architect as a facilitator of new conceptualization or relation between formal and informal. Because that's unfortunately the pendulum continues to oscillate between these categories, creating antagonism. A lot of people just talk about what we do as just dealing with informal. I'm interested in the informal or the small to be the device to rethink the large. The confrontation of top-down and bottom-up, this is the project, the space in between those, between economic capital and social capital once more come back to us again, and it's awful also that capital has to be the noun there, but what I'm trying to say is the human resourcefulness and the kind of entrepreneurial agency of these neighborhoods in terms of immigrants really constructing the city and therefore producing a new conception of citizenship, as I mentioned yesterday, as a creative act that reorganizes behaviors and institutions. So for me, this became a very important, but really the base of it, he was blown away. I mean, he really got it, and he understood the potential of rethinking zoning based on these alterations by immigrants and so on. So these are thresholds of the conversation. They don't need to be that accurate, but yes, it would be great to understand it more accurately at times. All I know is that when this confetti deposits itself into the scale of the neighborhood, what happens is that those parcels that were designed just to accommodate one house, surrounded by green, they begin to be altered into these alternative economies or densities. I'm talking about an immigrant family plugging an informal economy into a garage, or sharing the setback space between two families to construct an illegal extra unit for an extended family. And so these economic and social contingencies, I call it, right? This urbanism of alteration and adaptation is what, in my mind, will set up the future of Southern California. If we are really going to think of sustainability, the pixelation of the large with the small, and that means typologically, but also ultimately programmatically. So this is what happens in these neighborhoods. Go back to, how would I call it, small lot development, and so on. Incremental densities, and so on. So part of the task, I think, is to rethink the pro forma of the developer, as I was mentioning, and the redistribution of profit, and the rethinking of lending structures, and the rethinking or the expansion of categories of zoning and mixed use. We have had workshops in these communities about what is mixed use, what is density, and so on. Because we began to realize that mixed use is more than just a Starbucks on the sidewalk. It's about alternative programming. It's about how a community can produce and many other things. You can begin to imagine very different conceptualizations of economy. Cases, in other words, can they perform, and this is actually Omar one definition of community in my mind, which I'm working out at this moment. Can the redistribution of resources, numbers in that pro forma be a way of constructing a community? Approximating a pro forma and people, and resources. For example, can a pro forma of development absorb the entrepreneurial agency of two women in a particular neighborhood who rent a 3-bedroom house or apartment, transform into a small daycare illegally, and can that be brought into the social service structure of a community-based agency to produce funding or support or translation? These are real cases. You can construct, they can improve their house and their what happens though, in my mind, this is my criticism, even though I in my mind, is that without social monitoring, in other words, without the agencies that can mediate exploitation, or at least facilitate levels of modulating that, you perpetuate at the scale of the slum in the neoliberal model, where people just improve their houses and individual property, sell it, and go to the next slum. That maps, documents all the illegal alterations in the last 40 years. The small garage turned into an illegal business, the 2 extra units behind the house for extended families that are stealth, that are not allowed. How do we make all of those alterations part of the official zoning of this, So there are issues here that I know for artists are problematic. How do we visualize the insurgent? Can be problematic because when you expose also these contradictions that should not really, they should remain hidden at times, but that's an issue that for me is important in the sustainability of this neighborhood. They need to be brought to another level, but yet with certain protections. And this is where these agencies become the, the representatives. And so this is a very difficult topic, but the point is that the non-profit, we began to map all the pixelation that I talked before in mapping those alterations and bring them to the municipality. We want to create a new zoning for this neighborhood. Then another thing in the beginning, another tool as the non-profit turned into a think tank. There are 4 roles that we presented to the municipality. First, the non-profit as a think tank of production of new knowledge on the alterations, and workshops for 2-3 years, working with the community to demystify many issues. Many of you who work with communities know that sometimes, similar to new urbanists, the whole discussion is centered on style. The packaging of identity through these stylistic or formal devices. When I came to this community, the first workshop that when we talked about this topic, the commentaries that we got from people was that what they wanted was a Costco, you know that, like a big, like a Walmart, with the image of Aztec pyramids. Like, you know, have it like, and it's like, very, or Spanish colonial bungalows, that's what they or the point is that we began to create workshops that could demystify or problematize that. It's not to say that the community is ignorant, which I feel that in many ways the public is ignorant of certain ways of really rethinking itself. Professionals equally suffer from that ignorance. So there is this constant sort of sharing of misunderstandings, and nobody's problematizing that debate. So in that sense, I think, again, as I mentioned yesterday, the project of intervention is in the debate itself. So we began to create, we produced a set of games. This is the one with density. I did not have time yesterday to really talk about it. There were more images than these. Urban pedagogy again. So rethinking the workshops and the tools to enable a different conversation. So brought this model, had parcels, 5,000 square feet, pieces of wood symbolizing units, wood, trees, and cars. The alley, this is all the fabrics. And here I am at my table, and I asked the people at my table, build 15 units, as if they were planners. You are the planners now. Just build 15 units, and everybody froze. Everybody, This lady took one piece of wood, put it in one parcel, another piece of wood, put it in another parcel, another piece of wood, put it in another parcel. She reproduced the reality of her own block, individual homes and individual parcels. Then this man took the 2 pieces of wood and put them together. Well, what if we were to put the 2 units in a 0 setback, and then maybe we can create a connection between the alley and the street? Everybody began to get excited. This lady began to put wood all over the place. You know, and in Spanish, she told me, Señor, you know, no puedo creer que estas casas sean egoístas. I cannot believe that these houses are selfish. This is where I borrowed this notion of selfish urbanization. And then she said, I remember when I was a kid in Guadalajara, Mexico. This is a beautiful thing, because this is filled with anecdotes and conversations. She said, I remember now that the block where I used to live was not made of individual buildings, it was a large building, she said. But it had like courtyards, and you know, the most traditional kind of notion of. But it's interesting because she began to realize, and we talked about it in her own language, and this is part of, you know, we are academics, and she began to conceive, she conceived in essence 3 notions of density. 1, not driven by objects, but by spaces. We talked about that. 2, density as neighborhood collaboration. You know, I said the kind of one block of the property owners can share their property lines and so on. And there was another one that had to do with back to this issue of economy and so on. So it was a very amazing conversation we had. This is what I'm talking about. We were rethinking those very notions together. We presented this to the municipality, and the idea was that the second role, which I'm realizing, Ursula, yesterday I didn't really explain it correctly, because the second role was that the non-profit would become an informal city hall at the scale of the neighborhood. As more immigrants would enter into the United States unavoidably, the decentralization of government, creating partnerships with non-profits in environments to enable information and the facilitation of permits at the scale of those neighborhoods is important. So in here, not only the non-profit mapped the illegal, but translated it into new development possibilities by facilitating permits and the process that otherwise is Kafkaesque, because these people would never even go to downtown to solicit a permit processes that they would never understand. It's super complex. So the non-profit then began to engage residents as partners and presented a logic of development. In other words, yes?
And in this non-profit, who are those people in the non-profit? Because the next diagram is pointing to architects over here and someone else over here. What is who are the people? So the non-profit, emblematically in this drawing, I just show the main director, who is a social organizer. The first phase was enabled by partnership with me as an architect and workshops, and so that in terms of the think tank, of course we consult this together. But the non-profit is a typical NGO that began 30 years ago in many of these migrant neighborhoods to provide services that the government otherwise wouldn't. And that through time, out of their own methods of survival that need to be also, by the way, analyzed, they have become sustainable. And now they are purchasing land to begin to secure a very definition of property. They are becoming developers, which in fact might have to do with the neighborhood associations of the Netherlands, those histories that somehow got lost, and so on. That's what the type of NGO that this is about. I'm saying this because, you know, when I think of New Orleans and many of these places in the United States that have been destroyed or Detroit, the land is super cheap. And I do not understand, the first layer is to invite some of the most progressive NGOs which are in the same type of, to come and purchase land first. Let's secure the ground, and then let's rethink the models. This is, you know, I know that I said yesterday a lot of people are suspicious of NGOs here for obvious reasons, but I'm talking a very different scale of operation in neighborhoods. So anyway, I'm saying this, by the way, because all of you come from urbanism or architecture, or I don't know if you, for example, when we are in school, you know, I remember when I learned about Ebenezer Howard.
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, yes, okay.
That's lunch discussion.
So, the property owners and the non-profit forming a partnership, facilitating permits, because when the city allowed us to transform that illegal unit into a new one, that illegal unit needs to be retrofitted or rebuilt because they don't have a structural stability. So the non-profit now processes those permits. In other words, the municipality enabled the non-profit by pre-approving some of those units that be accessible by these residents. And finally, the issue of small scale, I mean, the points, in other words, second role, third role already, the facilitating of permits and mediating that information and partnerships, enabling the resident to become a small developer with the non-profit. This partnership is important to prevent gentrification. It's a social contract. Also, the fact that in many of these neighborhoods is where the builders are, the labor force is there. So the idea that they would be involved in the kind of local economy of construction for sweat equity comes into the equation, and so on. The idea that the large 50-unit loan could be prepackaged and distributed as small loans. This was a huge advancement. So the non-profit becomes a representative against the bank in terms of that 50-unit based subsidy. But instead of a big building, that is distributed into 50 pieces and they are pre-packaged. That was a huge advancement, and so on.
So you were able to change the regulations?
Yes. That's what I'm saying is part of the small alternative. A lot of people say, well, but you're still working, negotiating with the enemy. It's about this alteration of, and incrementally that began to produce the support system. If it, once it's enacted, then it begins to make a dent into the regulation of tax credits that do not support small-scale development. Anyway, parcels, just to finish, the project of this micro-policy had special consequences because we began to look at small parcels as small socio-economic systems. And the case study or the main example, because we're doing a series of small projects with them, but the main example is this one. I call it the performance of a parcel. That shows how can these small parcels be developed. The non-profit has been, they bought two small parcels here together. One of the parcels had an old building, a church from 1925. The adaptive reuse of this existing fabric is important. Small-scale development. So the performance of the parcel here involves the retrofitting of this church into a cultural engine type of incubator space, which is important, became the hinge for the project. This is not that far from reality. I saw in the New York Times, into the street, into the other street, workshops, small businesses, and the church. This was a small infrastructure that became the base for now housing. So I'm thinking again, how you plug housing with support systems. Housing cannot exist on its own. That was a revelation. And the housing now begins to be stitched through different typologies or economies of housing, even inside a very small parcel. So this building is for small, for either young couples or single mothers with children. And the premise there is that they collaborate in co-managing the programs that occur here. This is part of the essential issue here. Residents are not customers, are participants. And in that sense, they co-manage and co-own some of those resources.
Co-manage or own those who have the workshops live up there?
Yes, yes. And they become enablers of some of that production of the workshops or the markets and so on. This is a huge piece of the process that we are working more and more with. Tax credits in the regulations, because of some kind of strange idea of democracy, people cannot be selective in this case. In other words, it's just based on first come, first serve, as they say. In other words, only based on need. But what happens is that in these neighborhoods, there are a lot of people who not only are in need, but they already are participating out of volunteerism. Social organizers in themselves. So the idea was to mix very specific characters with other people so that they begin to organize, others. Then a duplex for artists who will exchange rent for social service. And so they, in fact, the video is more animated in this case, but the artists are the ones who interface with not only the residents, but with other members of the community. In other words, artists design pedagogical models. The non-profit director was very adamant about this. Art is imposed on us as just a superfluous kind of thing. We need to really understand what is behind art. So there is this whole kind of opening up of processes, awareness, and so on. You see what I'm saying? Art is a luxury, and so on. And so I think this interface, I like these images at times because buildings begin to talk to each other. The duplex and the spaces, the single mothers building with co-managing those large units for large families who live with grandmothers, which was another type that emerged, sharing kitchens. The idea was that the families would become partners with the non-profit, so they would also enable some kind of accessibility to funding for, this is what I'm talking about, expanded notions of mixed use, you know, because these are not just the Starbucks, these are spaces available for producing economy. And the extended buildings, we found out in the code a particular unit called accessory unit, which in the code is basically a small building, 120 square feet, 12 square meters. If a building is no larger than that, does not need a permit. So it can be built by local labor. And we thought 10 by 12 is a pretty good, if we give it a 15-foot ceiling height, utility sink, and a big window. I'm saying that because if the unit has a kitchen, if the space has a kitchen, then it transforms into a unit. By code, what defines a home is a kitchen. And what is interesting also is that the definition of family in the code is very, very expansive, which is very interesting in the United States. So anyway, all these devices become tools too. So what we did was this became extended family units. This one is for a gardener who wants to collaborate and manage the, you know, with the people. So these are more flexible spaces. But in essence, even though it sounds obvious, this is the challenge I thought for conventional development. Developers cannot build different economies of housing, addressing different social compositions, and injecting the infrastructural devices to manage the interfaces across programs. The performance that developers use produce the homogeneity we see. And this is the evidence here. There's only one type of building in these miles and miles here. It's that block with I don't know how many units. And so for us, what's an important thing to say to the municipality? In a small parcel, we can accommodate different housing economies, different configurations, addressing different social compositions that emerge from the everyday life of this neighborhood. But not only that, the adjacent spaces are not just inert, decorative spaces. They are charged with programming that is curated by the non-profit, the artists, and others, and the community itself. This issue of ownership is good. So that's what that produces the case study for this neighborhood. The notion that they are plugging housing with support systems. I wanted to show you something, you know, that translated tangibly the issue.